Hello, everyone. In this week's lecture, it is time to talk about the Civil War. The Civil War is another one of those big things in American history that we perceive as one uniform item that happened and had a definitive result. The Civil War was caused by slavery. It ended with the abolition of slavery. That's probably and it's not untrue. I mean, this is clearly what happened here. However, only the first part is true. The Civil War, the reason the Civil War happened is slavery. And it's not an accident that it ended slavery. But at any point during this conflict, that it was going to have that outcome was far from clear. And it was contested throughout. And not just between North and South people fighting. There was also violent conflict within northern and southern states. In the South, the slaves who were, of course, on the side of the Union that was going to liberate them. And in the North, the white working class that had long and deep-seated antipathies towards African Americans and sympathies for the slaveholders. So once more, war that looks like something to do with armies that meet on battlefields. Certainly these battles are important. If the Union had lost at Gettysburg, the outcome could have been very different. If the British and the French would have gotten involved and the Union would have lost because of that, the outcome would have been very different. But underneath that all is social conflict. And the way that plays out sets the parameters for how the military conflict can be conducted. If you don't have your back free, because in your own hinterland, in your own society, conflict forces you to redirect or rededicate resources to the home front rather than being able to fight on the front with the enemy, that has an impact. Likewise, the goals that people fight wars for, the war goals of the conflicting parties, are shaped by people's interests and demands in the societies. So let's look at the more detailed and differentiated story. First, why did the South secede? Because the Civil War started when South Carolina, shortly thereafter, followed by a number of other southern states, said, we are no longer part of the United States. We're going to form another country in which slavery is and will remain legal for all eternity. We're calling it the Confederate States of America. This was precipitated by Lincoln's election, but not because the election of Lincoln meant the end of slavery. Lincoln had not run on a platform of abolishing slavery. He had merely had the audacity of not rejecting abolitionism outright, of allowing the criticism of slavery to go unchallenged in the Republican Party. He never said in running for election that if you elect me, I'm going to make sure slavery ends. It would have been very hard. It would have involved constitutional amendments and so forth. And the way that the institutions were stacked, that wasn't going to happen. So nonetheless, the South wasn't going to take any chances. They were so committed to that peculiar institution, as they call it, of slavery, that even the hint of losing the absolute unquestioning support of all federal institutions for slavery, positively supporting slavery, the loss of even part of that was not to them acceptable. So if they couldn't have all of the government all the time on their side, in their corner, they were going to break the United States. The North, at that point, the majority public opinion in the North thought this is not worth having war over. Let them go. We're finally rid of them. The slaveholders were unpopular. They were politically out of touch with the majority in the North, although crucially they had the support of the white working class, as I said. And nobody really seemed to think that it would be a good idea to go to war and risk lives and spend lots of money. And you'd rather let the South go. And of course, that did entail to say, well, okay, fine, we'll wash our hands of the slaves, let them remain in slavery. That changed when South Carolina started the hostilities of war. They bombarded Fort Sumter, which was manned by the US Navy on an island in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. There you had the first casualties of war. And of course, over Fort Sumter flew the Star-Spangled Banner, the American flag. And as paintings of that event and as stories about that event, Americans shooting at American military, the United States flag being under fire, reached the North, the picture completely changed. And patriotism took over. And this wave of patriotism allowed Abraham Lincoln to say, we're not going to let the South go without a fight. We're going to go to war to keep the South in the Union. But even at this point, still at this point, Lincoln said that this is not about slavery. The South may want to leave because they want to keep their slaves. For us, however, we're not fighting to free the slaves. We are fighting to keep the Union together. If this has an effect on slavery, so be it. And if it has none, that's fine by us too. So what changed? If the war aim in the beginning was not to end slavery, what changed is that the economic and social conflict that unfolded both in the North and in the South created an opening to make this about ending slavery. And then when you make the war about ending slavery, then the next big question that people at the time really didn't want to answer is, and what happens with the Africans? What happens with the African Americans, the people who had been slaves? Now they will be members of American society. How? As equals, as citizens who get to elect representatives? Will we send them back to Africa? Will they get their own state or separate nation on American soil? Nobody really wanted to deal with that question because, correctly, even politicians sympathetic to abolition feared that this would stir up racism. And so that also did happen, and we'll get to that. Now, before we reach the turning point, however, where the South and North suddenly fight over slavery officially, where the North says, yes, we are in this to liberate the slaves, when the North was fighting to preserve the Union, they were also fighting for the validity of the law of the land as had existed before the South left in all of the states, meaning slavery had been legal, and not just legal, but had enjoyed strong protections based on the decisions of the Supreme Court up until 1861, and still after that, you had to return any escaped slaves to their rightful owners. You could not discuss the matter of slavery in Congress, and so on. There was no if there was no such thing as a free black person, as a freed slave, according to the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court handed down in 1857. If you're a property of somebody in one state, that property right weighs heavier than any personal right to freedom you think you might have. So if Lincoln is fighting the war to preserve the Union, he, as the president, is also sworn to uphold the laws, and therefore insists that the army return any slaves that have escaped the plantation and have crossed the lines to the Union must be returned during ceasefire, just like you would exchange captives or injured soldiers in ceasefires on a regular basis. He says you have to bring back the slaves. Because of the war theater, where there wasn't just one area of conflict, the Union Army maintained several separate districts, and this becomes important for how the army actually fights this war, because it turns out once a Union army has captured a part of the South, and once the commander of that army becomes the in fact, the governor of the conquered territory. It is largely up to him what happens with the slaves. And there is a wide difference in that how that is handled. There are two main examples of this. One area in which the Union captured lots of land with many slave plantations on it was in Tennessee. The state bordering Tennessee in the north is Kentucky, and that had remained loyal to the Union. So as the Union Army marched south along the very wide border between Tennessee and Kentucky, they left the slave owners in charge of their plantations, and any slave that had escaped was returned. And if you couldn't figure out exactly whom he belonged to, the army went out of its way to locate the rightful owner and make sure that the slave returned to slavery. And just for good measure, the commander of this particular army also expelled all Jews from not just the occupied parts of Tennessee, but most of Kentucky, because he considered them on racial grounds to be inherently traitorous and a security risk. So here you have the racist views, the anti-Semitic views of a general shaping the response of the Union to the orders by Lincoln to return the slaves. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, in Virginia, the Army of the James, named after the river that was the main river in their area of operation, a man from Massachusetts, General Benjamin Butler, who had long been an abolitionist, was in charge. And he did not like that he had to return the slaves to their owners. He didn't think people should have owners or that there should be slaves. So he came up with an inventive way of following Lincoln's orders to the letter while subverting them, in fact. He argued that, fine, slaves are property. How do armies deal with property belonging to enemy civilians? Of course, under the laws of war, they return them to their rightful owners. On the other hand, if the property that is captured and identified as belonging to an enemy civilian is inherently designed to be used in the war effort, then it is fair game. So if in a blockade of a coast, you capture a merchant vessel, you have to let the vessel go, you have to let the cargo go if it turns out to belong to an enemy civilian merchant. But if you also find crates of weapons and ammunition on that ship, that stuff you may legally take because it is contraband, the type of enemy civilian private property that is inherently designed to be used against you in the war effort. So Butler said, the slaves are that kind of private property. They are contraband. How is the South going to fight the war without the slaves doing all the work behind the lines while their masters are away fighting the war? Therefore, this is the kind of property inherently needed to fight the war against us, and I am allowed to confiscate it. So he told the slaves, you are now my property. You belong to the United States Army. And then he started employing them for wages in doing things in the Union camps, digging ditches, washing dishes, doing the laundry, and so forth, with the understanding that eventually his goal was to set them free, but he couldn't officially do that quite yet. But of course, most of these slaves were quite happy to help with the effort to fight their masters, especially now since they were off the plantation. Clearly, this couldn't go on forever. That you have this night and day picture of just the implementation of racist ideas by the army in Tennessee and proto-emancipation going on in Virginia. Lincoln couldn't just let this go on parallel tracks. He had to make a call. And that call, in fact, is the Emancipation Proclamation. That's where he says, I'm siding with Butler on this issue, because the Emancipation Proclamation takes the same exact course that was lined out by Butler in his orders to his army. The Emancipation Proclamation argues that this is a war measure to liberate the slaves. It goes one step further by saying, and we're not just going to confiscate them and then own them as the army, but we're going to set them free, and we'll even allow them to sign up as soldiers. So the Emancipation Proclamation is cautious because first, when he writes it, he runs it by a couple of people in 1862. He issues it, he makes it public in September, and there's a 100-day grace period until it is to go into effect on January 1st, 1863, where the southern states are allowed to come back. And if they do that, if they lay down their arms and they abandon their rebellion, they can rejoin the Union under the laws as existed before, meaning they get to keep all their slaves. They get to keep slavery. The catch with this provision is that the border states that were slaveholding states but that never rebelled are not covered by the Emancipation Proclamation. And that leads to the absurd situation, and cruel really towards the slaves, that in Maryland, for instance, where you have many slaves, in a state that did not side with the Confederates but remained with the Union, slavery remains legal, whereas across the Potomac River in Virginia, the slaves are officially liberated once the Union takes over the plantation, because they live in a state in rebellion that's remained in rebellion after January 1st of 1863. And none of the states took up the offer. So when January 83 came around, all the slaves in the South were now considered free by the United States government. The problem, of course, is that he couldn't do anything about it because that land was still controlled by the Confederates. So critics of Lincoln, who considered his approach to be far too timid, said that he freed all the slaves that lived in places where he couldn't do anything about it. But in those places where he could have done something, like in Maryland, for instance, he didn't do anything to free them. So once again, not enough. And yet, it was widely understood that this declaration, this proclamation, meant that the war had now reached a turning point, and that the war aim of the Union had been redefined. It was no longer merely about keeping the Union together, but it really was about changing the terms on which this American Union functioned. It wasn't just about power, it wasn't just about territory, it was now about freedom, and it was about equality. And these are universal principles, where you can say this is not just the affair of a small, interested class of rich northern industrialists and their political wing, the Republican Party, that simply don't want to let go a competing elite, the slaveholders, and all the wealth that they take with them. No, at this point, it is really about universal principles. And this also shines through very clearly in the Gettysburg Address. So now that the cat was out of the sack, so to speak, now that it was clear that if the Union wins, the slaves will be free, race is on the table as an issue. In the South, it encourages the slaves to resist with all their might against their masters, and also to flee, because they know if they make it across the lines, they will be free, they will not be sent back, they will be protected, and they might even get to join the army and take up the fight themselves. In the North, the draft riots happen, and if you've already watched that part of Gangs of New York, you have a visual of that. This is part of a backlash against the liberation of slaves. It's about class and politics and race all wrapped in one, as parts of the white northern working class rise up against the government to resist the draft and to commit acts of lynching and murder of African Americans and of Republicans. Now, the draft riots fail in the sense that they're beaten back with military force although they do succeed in that the draft is off the table. No longer is everybody in the North going to be entered into the lottery and then drafted to join the army. They back off from that because they're afraid it's going to lead to another round of riots. But the white working class and their renewed commitment to racial inequality doesn't just go away. And the racism in the North doesn't simply go away. And the Democratic Party, which of course still exists in the North, and unlike the South, which immediately turns into in fact, dictatorship after it secedes. They no longer have free elections. They no longer have freedom of speech and so forth. In the North, democracy and constitutional freedoms continue as normal. And so in 1864, Lincoln is up for re-election. And the Democratic Party, which represents that northern white working class, and which historically was the voice and political arm of the Southern plantation owners, has every right to run a candidate against Lincoln. The slogan, the main catchphrase that the Democrats choose for that election campaign is miscegenation. It's an artificial creation as a word that means race mixing. As the cartoons and the literature published by Democrats in the North against Lincoln and the Republicans, against emancipation and against African Americans, clearly show, race mixing is not just about abstract equality as citizens, as market participants, as Americans. It is really about social equality. It's about, do you have to step out of the way for a black lady as you would for a white lady? Do you have to mingle with people of the opposite race in public spaces? And eventually, will your daughters marry black men and make mixed race children? That is the main focus of the cartoons in particular that incite the racist sentiment. Time and again, it is a role reversal where suddenly the blacks are in charge, they're the rich people, the whites are turned into the servants. It is the lecherous black men who prey on white women and then make racially mixed children, taking down the white race and watering down the stock of the white race in the process. So this is in stark visuals popularized in the North, and it is very effective because for the racists this speaks to their deepest fears, and it really gets their blood boiling. What do the Republicans do in response to this campaign of whipping up racist sentiment? They respond by vigorously denying that they like black people or want them to be equal to white people. They go to great lengths of denying as rumor the notion that the Republican Party is fighting, that the North and Lincoln are fighting for that kind of equality. So when they would have had a chance to take a stand and say, yes, we are in favor of emancipation, yes, we do believe in equality, with Jefferson, the founder, one of the founders of this country, they tucked in their tail and hid in a corner and were hoping that they would get elected in spite of the racism. But just to be safe, they also looked for a vice presidential nominee to run on Lincoln's ticket, who was the most racist Democrat they could find, who would still run on the same ticket as Abraham Lincoln in the flesh. And they found one, Andrew Johnson, planter, defender of slavery from Tennessee, who was willing to be Abraham Lincoln's running mate. And of course, that comes back to bite not just Republicans, but really everybody who fought for emancipation, because the vice president becomes the president if the president is killed. And Lincoln, as you might recall, is in fact assassinated. So the good news is that the same mobilization that happens in the draft riots in the North, on the flip side, happens in the South. The slaves are energized by the news that now the North is really officially fighting to free them. And they can do a lot of stuff to make life miserable for their masters. And they do. They sabotage, they slow down the work, they follow orders to the letter rather than in the intended meaning, and they run away in droves, and sometimes in groups if there is nobody around to stop them, or they'll just take their chance and say, well, just go and shoot us all then. Who's going to do the work for you anyway? So this empowerment is a direct result of the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, the next thing that happens is that African Americans are allowed to enlist as Union soldiers. They still have to serve in segregated regiments under white officers, but they get to have weapons and they get to fight in the war, and they turn out to be extremely brave and effective soldiers, which is something that wasn't supposed to happen according to the racist notions that the South had long promoted about what Africans are like. They turn out to be not like that at all. And ironically, they gain some respect among the Southerners as the fiercest soldiers to fight against on the other side. But what that does for the balance of power is you have now more than 100,000 black men under arms in total by the end of the Civil War. These are 100,000 positions in the army that you do not have to fill by forcing unwilling northern white racist workers to join the army under the draft. So the slaves really save Lincoln some trouble here by doing their part and filling in for the northern working class that refuses to the point of insurrection to fight in this war. So it couldn't have been done without them. And while the war is still going on, the northern government has the foresight to also look at the future. What happens when we win this war? And increasingly, it looks likely that they will win this war. What are we going to do about race relations and citizenship in this country? So on these relatively isolated sea islands off the coast of various eastern states, Virginia through Florida, really, where it's the prime cotton growing country, there are experiments in trying to run a society of equal citizens with free blacks as market participants and voters and so forth, to see how that goes. And we'll talk more about that next week. Now, in 1865, days after the Union Army accepts the capitulation of the Confederate Army, Lincoln is shot. And as a result, the vice president takes over and almost immediately moves to undo the results of the war. For example, General Sherman, one of those generals who, like Benjamin Butler, was heavily in favor of freeing the slaves, had taken away land from slave owners, had confiscated the land, and had divided it into small farms and given it to the ex-slaves as their own. And here are people who had been farming that land for 2 or 3 years in some cases when Johnson took over. And Johnson issued an executive order returning all that land to the original owners, some of whom had fled or died and wanted nothing further to do with it. But with the zeal to equal that of that Union commander who had expelled the Jews from Tennessee and Kentucky, Johnson insisted that the South be set right again, that the slaves be, that the freed people be treated as much as slaves as possible. So that made necessary several constitutional amendments that really nailed down that no, there is no more slavery, no, you cannot deny somebody the right to vote or to citizenship because of their race, and so forth. And yet the South was always looking for the loophole, always looking for the omission in the wording that would allow them to weasel in a law that nonetheless achieved discrimination, the exclusion from the right to vote, and so forth. And so this is an ongoing story, of course, with the present culling of the voter rolls and the voter ID laws and so forth. It is just another turn in this long and ongoing story. But congressional Republicans at the time were not going to let Johnson get away with it. And Congress is quite powerful if it wants to. And what they basically end up doing is they build a legislative wall around Johnson, limiting what he is allowed to do as president. In the end, running the government from through congressional committees, and confining Johnson's powers to more or less just the decision what he's going to have for breakfast, and possibly what type of stationery to get for his correspondence, but nothing more than that. However, the congressional Republican plan for the reconstruction of the South has many enemies. They want to really see through civic equality, and they also want to make sure that the economic power of the landed elite of the South is broken. And under the slogan of 40 acres and a mule as the stock, you would set up each free family of ex-slaves with to get a start as independent farmers. That is a crucial part of it. So this redistribution of land. There are many in the North, among the Republican Party, who don't want that. This is the group of people who are the financiers, the donors to the Republican Party, the capitalists, the Northern merchants and bankers, who really didn't think that, who really thought that the best outcome of the Civil War was that if in the end they ended up owning all that nice plantation land, producing all that cotton, profitable as it is, for their own factories and for their own trade, with a labor force of African Americans that is available, if not for free, then at least for very, very cheap. And in their response to the demands and the assertiveness, and this is something we'll see in more detail next week, of the freed people, of the ex-slaves, who are saying and who are demonstrating their ability and willingness to become independent farmers rather than continue to work for wages, as slaves, as sharecroppers, or whatever, for a white master of some sort. Their reaction to that wish for independence, economic independence among blacks, is vicious and violent. And in the process of that response, of that backlash by the Northern economic elite, by Northern capital, against a free, racially equal society, the racism that was part of the thinking of the Southern planter class migrates north. It becomes a tool in the toolbox of class warfare from above for the Northern elite. And it is turned around and modified in the end also against immigrants, and in fact against anybody in the working class, ultimately even against the whitest and most Protestant group of property owning respectable citizens in the Northern United States, farmers in Kansas and Nebraska and such places, by the time you reach the 1890s. So it morphs into a universal kind of disdain for people who don't have a lot of money, a social Darwinism, a delegitimization of all claims to economic opportunity and justice for those who do not already have everything. But this social Darwinism, this glorification of inequality and of obscene unearned wealth and privilege, gets its start on the slave plantation after the end of the Civil War and in the struggle between the new masters, Northern capital, and the free people over who is going to be in charge. So in congressional Republicans, the freed people have a strong ally. They also have an ally in veterans who fought in the South and revised their views of race while they were soldiers fighting alongside black men. But in the end, that isn't enough. And it takes 10, and in some states, 30 years to fully roll back the accomplishments of the Civil War. But by 1900, it is almost as if the Civil War had never happened. And many now talk about it at that point around 1900 as if it had just been one big mistake and misunderstanding. Because why on earth would we want to free black people? And certainly we wouldn't want them to be equal. So somebody must have committed a big mistake here. But in 1865, there was a moment when freedom, equality, and all that seemed possible and was real. So let's stop for a moment and consider that accomplishment. And I've been talking about the racist northern white working class, but of course that is just one component of that northern white working class. There are also many who aren't racist and who bravely fought because they believed in freedom and equality. And they believed that the United States stood for freedom and stood for equality as universal principles to free the slaves as well, and who are part of the heroic side of this story. So yes, rarely is this the case that you have a narrative in history where you can say there are some people who fought for good. Usually that's something that historians make up later to make other people feel better about themselves in a way of heritage engineering. But here, yes, you do have people who heroically and selflessly did good. And the fact that they were cheated out of that result by powerful forces that were self-interested doesn't diminish that accomplishment. So on that high note, I want to conclude this lecture and hope that from the group this week, we will hear more about the Emancipation Proclamation, as well as the Gettysburg Address, that gives us a sense of how Lincoln was working within these social and political fields that constrained and enabled his policies. So that's that.